As a DoorDash driver, I had seen my fair share of strange delivery locations, but the abandoned house on the edge of town definitely took the first prize. When I arrived, the windows were boarded up and the overgrown weeds made it seem like nobody had lived there in years, and yet this was the correct location. Now, my first thought was that this was some sort of prank delivery, but who in their right mind would prepay for $300 worth of food as a simple joke? Well, either way, I went against my better judgment and got out of my car and approached the house. When I knocked on the door, I noticed a deep, rumbling sound, which immediately raised my suspicions further. I waited at the door for a few more seconds as the tension started to build. I knew I needed to knock on the door again, but I really didn't want to. Well, I eventually found the courage and knocked 3 more times, slowly and deliberate. And this time, I started to hear shuffling footsteps from behind the door, and I felt my heart sink. And then, suddenly, the door swung open to reveal something which still haunts my dreams. My eyes were immediately drawn towards a group of people dressed in black robes, sitting in a circle, holding hands while they hummed in unison. They were gathered around a table that was covered in candles and didn't seem to be fazed at all by my arrival. I hesitated at first, but before I could turn around, one of the cult members who had answered the door grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. "You're just in time," the man said, his grip tightening. "We've all been waiting for you." I tried to pull away, but the man wouldn't let go. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The man just smiled, revealing a few missing teeth. "Well, we're hungry, my friend, and you have brought us a feast." I glanced at the table and saw several empty plates, followed by 2 empty chairs. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay," I said, slowly backing away. "I have other deliveries to make." But by this point, several other cult members had gathered by the door and were now blocking my exit. Their eyes filled with a strange intensity. I knew I was in deep trouble, as the strong grip on my arm was loosened, and I was free to move, but with nowhere to go. I could feel a panic start to set in my mind, and I began to wonder if this could be the end of my life. But then, out of seemingly nowhere, a wad of cash was flashed in front of my face. "Please, I insist, stay and eat with us. We promise it will be worth your while." Now, I could instantly tell that this was much more than $300. The wad was as big as my hand, and unless they were paying me in $1 bills, I could tell there was a very big tip in it for me, if I agreed to stay. I hesitated, tempted by the money and fearful of what might happen if I asked to leave again. But something about the way they were all staring at me made me so uneasy. I knew I had to get out of there before it was too late. "I'm sorry, but I have to go," I said, pushing past the cult members and running out of the door. Surprisingly, they didn't try and stop me, but I could feel all of their eyes burning on the back of my head as I ran toward my car. I quickly sped off down the road, heading for the restaurant, and when I arrived, I explained what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They actually demanded that I return and get the cash, as it was a costly order and they needed the money. Well, I refused, claiming that I wasn't willing to risk my life over a stupid DoorDash delivery, and I quit that very same day. Anyway, weeks had eventually gone by, and part of me was curious to see if the restaurant had gotten somebody else to pick up the money. I knew it was possible that the cult weren't necessarily going to kill me or anything. I mean, if they wanted to do that, they had a very good opportunity that night. But still, I felt like if I'd accepted that money, I may have been convinced to do something that I'd regret. Well, my suspicions were correct, as a rumour started to spread that there was a cult in town, and that they were pestering people to join. Apparently their calling card was to invite people over to the house and try to convert them using money and other persuasive techniques. Now, I wouldn't say I'm somebody who is easily manipulated, but the money was tempting even for me, so I could see how someone who was really struggling for money may have been swayed to stay, because my guess is that there was almost $500 in that wad of cash. But either way, I'm just so relieved that I made the right choice that night, and I know I will never deliver food again, because you never really know who's going to be behind that door. I had been searching for a new couch for weeks when I finally found the perfect one on Craigslist. It was a beautiful vintage piece that would fit perfectly in my living room, so I quickly contacted the seller and arranged for delivery that same day. I thought it was a great deal because not only was I getting a couch for a great price, but also the guy selling it was willing to drive all the way over to my house to deliver it in person. So, later that day, the man arrived with the couch, but I noticed he was quite strange from the moment I opened the door. He had long, greasy hair and piercing blue eyes, but it looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. He didn't even introduce himself, but instead silently carried the couch into my living room and set it down. I offered to help, but he waved me off and insisted on doing it himself, so I just backed off and let him get on with it. As he moved the couch, I noticed that he seemed to be struggling with it, as if it was heavier than he expected. But again, when I tried to lend a hand, he snapped at me and told me to stay out of the way. So I decided to give him more space and retreated to the kitchen to make some tea. I remember as I was waiting for the kettle to boil, I heard a strange noise coming from the living room. It sounded like someone was whispering, but I couldn't make out any words. I called out to the man, asking if everything was okay, but he didn't respond. When I walked back into the living room, I found the man standing in front of the couch, staring at it intently. His eyes were wide and his breathing was heavy. I asked him if he was feeling all right, but he just ignored me. But then suddenly, the man turned to face me, and I could see that his eyes had changed. They were no longer a bright blue, but instead they were almost black and soulless. It was as if he was possessed by something evil. "Are you sure you want this couch?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. I tried to back away, but the man took a step forward. "You can't leave without taking it, for it is already inside of you." Now, I had no idea what this meant, but I knew it wasn't good, so I pushed past him and ran to my own front door. But as I tried to flee, he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me back. As I struggled to escape his grip, I noticed something odd about the couch. There were strange markings etched into the fabric, symbols that I didn't recognize. And then I saw something move inside the cushions, something dark and writhing. I screamed and fought harder, and finally managed to break free and run out of the apartment. But as I fled down the stairs, I could hear the man laughing maniacally behind me. I reported the incident to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. They said that I was probably just imagining things and I shouldn't have bought a couch off of Craigslist in the first place. But I knew what I had seen, and there was no way that I was going back to that apartment with that couch inside of there, and possibly that man. Well, anyway, I had no choice, and I had to return back to my place in order to see if he had finally left and if I could just move on with my life. And as I arrived at the apartment, I noticed those same markings that were on the couch were now on my floor. But the man was gone. Again, I didn't know what to make of this, so I just called the police and demanded that they send a car over immediately, as the case had clearly escalated since I last spoke to them. They did send a car round eventually, and they took down some notes, but nothing ever happened. The irony was that I ended up having to spend money to get rid of that couch, so I may as well have just bought a regular priced couch from anywhere. But hey, at least I learnt my lesson, right? I've been an Amazon delivery driver for about 5 years now, so it's safe to say I've seen all sorts of things on the job in my time. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on a quiet street one evening. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening, and I was working a late shift to try and earn some extra money. At the time, I was saving up as much as possible so I could put a down payment on a house for me and my now ex-girlfriend. There's definitely a few horror stories I could tell you from that relationship, but I think I'll save those for another day. Anyway, so I pulled up to the house, package in hand, and knocked on the door as normal. There was nothing too suspicious about the house. The front lawn was a bit messy and the fence could have used a lick of paint, but other than that, it just looked like any suburban home. I waited patiently for somebody to answer, but I couldn't hear any movement inside the house. I knocked again, but this time much louder, hoping that if somebody was home, they'd be able to hear me this time. Well, after my second attempt, I noticed the door had slowly creaked open, and something about the way the door moved sent a strange feeling throughout my body. Looking back, it's difficult to explain why it was so unnerving. I guess it was just an instinctual reaction to something only my subconscious could pick up. I hesitated, wondering if I should just leave the package on the doorstep and go, but I needed a signature to complete the delivery, and at the time my paycheck was dependent on how many successful deliveries I made. So, with my future in mind, I went against my better judgment and slowly stepped inside, peering my head around the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing throughout the empty hallway. It was almost pitch black in there, the only light coming from the streetlights outside, illuminating the way. I didn't get a reply, and so I creeped further in, hoping to see if I could get a better sense if anybody was home. But wherever I looked, it was dark, and it became clear to me that there was nobody in that house. So I took one last glance and gave up, assuming that I was just wasting my time. But as I stepped 1 foot outside the house, I suddenly heard a faint whisper from one of the back rooms. I could just about make out it was a woman's voice saying something along the lines of, "I'm back here." I was so relieved that someone was home, and I made my way towards the sound. But as I got closer, that same unnerving feeling resurfaced, and it felt like my body was screaming at me to retreat. There was a strange smell in the air, as if somebody had been cooking some rotten meat, and I swear I almost gagged as I moved further into the house. I called out again, asking if everything was okay, but I received no response. I remember thinking at the time, it's probably just a little old lady who's been struggling with cleaning the house or something, as her voice was quite weak and raspy. To be honest, her voice actually reminded me of my own grandma, and part of me felt obliged to soldier on despite all of the warning signs telling me to turn back. So, I kept moving towards the sound, and that's when I noticed a dim light burning in the kitchen. I crept inside and called out to her once again, asking where she was and if everything was okay. And then I saw her. It was a tiny old lady, and she was sitting in the corner, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't quite make out her face, but I could sense that something was wrong. No matter what I asked her, she continued to ignore me, as if she was in a trance or something. I could see her eyes were open, but whenever I would say anything, she would just continue staring at the floor. In the end, I asked her if I should call an ambulance, and she suddenly perked up and rose to her feet almost immediately. She stared right into my eyes and told me not to worry and apologized for the inconvenience. She claimed that she was on some new medication that was making her a bit drowsy and she would struggle to stay awake at times, but this didn't do too much to ease my fear. She had this warm smile combined with a pair of wide eyes that felt like they didn't belong to her face. But despite my fear, I held it together and simply told her not to worry and that I just needed her signature quickly and I would be gone. She replied, "Of course, young man," and approached me slowly, but without breaking eye contact. It was honestly so unnerving. I felt like I was in a horror movie and I was the idiot that didn't just run away after sensing danger. But I remained strong and handed her the device for her to sign. To my surprise, she didn't struggle like I thought she would. In my experience, the older customers usually had some trouble with signing their name on a small device, but her signature was flawless. Anyway, I handed her the package and she asked me to set it down on the floor, as she didn't want to hurt her back. I did as she asked and set down the package, but as it connected with the floor, I could sense that it was hollow, as if there was something below. Now, this isn't particularly scary, but after I'd worked myself up, this really was the last straw for me. I was not going to be the next victim of some crazy old lady that likes to keep delivery drivers in her basement. So with that, I wished her well and headed out the dark kitchen, towards the front door. But as I turned around, I heard her whisper something under her breath. I turned back and asked her to repeat herself as I'd missed what she said, but she just smiled once again and told me not to worry. Her voice was louder all of a sudden, more pronounced, like she was back from her trance and fully conscious again. I just awkwardly smiled back and power-walked to the front door, and pretty much ran to my van. Now, this experience would have been scary enough, but as I began to pull away from the house, I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked out the van window and saw that same little old lady standing in her doorway, but this time there was no smile. I slammed my foot down on the gas and sped off, not looking back. Over the years, I've told this story to my friends so many times, and they always end up laughing at me. I guess it is kind of funny that a small old lady was able to scare me this much, but as I always tell them, if you were in my position, trust me, you would have been just as terrified. I had been looking forward to my Friday night in all week. Ordering some Chinese takeout and settling down to watch some movies was one of my favourite things to do. I lived alone at the time, but I really didn't mind. I always enjoyed my own company and I liked having the freedom to do whatever I wanted without having to answer to anyone. That night I called my local Chinese restaurant, but they were apparently extremely busy, giving me an estimated delivery time of around 2 hours. Now, this place was honestly the best Chinese in town, so I did consider waiting at first, but my stomach rumbled with reservation, and I reluctantly ended up deciding to order food from another place. I downloaded one of the apps, and after looking through the menu, I ordered my food. At first, I was pleasantly surprised to see a 5-star rating and all my favourite dishes were available, so I didn't think too much of it and continued with my plans for the evening. However, I had failed to notice that the 5-star review for this restaurant was only based on 2 individual reviews, a fact which soon made itself very clear. Anyway, about an hour after placing my order, there was a knock at the door. I excitedly got up from the couch and checked the peephole, and saw a man standing outside my door. He was wearing a delivery uniform and he had a large white bag in his hand. I eagerly opened the door and was greeted with a strange-looking man with what looked like a black wig falling out of his baseball cap. "Hi there. I've got your delivery," he said, handing me the bag. I said thanks, taking the bag and rummaging in my pockets for a tip. As I struggled to search my pocket with one hand, he suddenly spoke again, asking, "Are you home alone?" His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, as I started to feel a great sense of unease. He was practically looking me up and down as he waited for my response, like I was a piece of meat. I felt a chill run down my spine at this question. I didn't want him to know I was home alone, but I was never a good liar. No, actually, my roommate is just in the shower," I said, trying to sound convincing, but the delivery man didn't seem convinced at all. He suddenly stepped forward, blocking me from closing the door. "Are you sure about that?" I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized that I was now in real danger. I tried to push him out so I could close the door, but he was too heavy and barely moved an inch. He just laughed and pushed his way into my apartment, slamming the door behind him. I screamed for him to get out, trying to push him back once again, but he just kept laughing, and that's when he grabbed me by the arm, pulling me towards him. "I don't think so," he said, his breath hot on my face. I did continue to struggle against him, but he just kept pushing me in whichever direction he wanted, which ended up being towards the living room, as I stumbled and fell onto the couch. "You're not going anywhere," he said, as he pulled something out of his pocket. I screamed for help, but I knew that no one would hear me. I used to think that one of the best aspects of my apartment was that it had very thick walls, so you could never hear the neighbours. But in this moment, it was far from a blessing. As I lied there, trying to stay strong and fight back, but also slowly growing closer to the inevitable reality that was quickly approaching, I remembered the lock on my bedroom door. I knew that if I could get there somehow, I had a chance to lock myself in and call the police. So I used all of my might and scratched at his face, causing him to take a step back as he covered his eye with one hand. I capitalized on the moment by scrambling to my feet and running towards the bedroom, but the man was right behind me the whole way, brandishing his weapon. I managed to make it to the bedroom without him catching me, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it as quickly as possible. I felt a momentary sense of relief, but knowing that the man was still outside, trying to force his way in, I also knew it was only a matter of time before he got in and would have me alone in my bedroom. I could hear him shouting and banging on the door, and I knew that he wasn't going to give up easily. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I told them what was happening. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep talking, and I obeyed, trying to distract myself from the sounds of the man outside. Well, eventually I hadn't heard him shouting, and it had been a few minutes since he last banged on the door. But this didn't mean I was safe. He very well could have been waiting for me to unlock the door to check if he had gone, and then he would use that moment to strike. Well, I was promised that an officer would arrive within 5 minutes, and to their credit, it wasn't long at all before I heard the sound of sirens outside. The police had arrived, and I was so relieved, but also still scared as I didn't know what this man was capable of. The police stormed into my apartment, and I heard them shouting, but there were no sounds of struggle. They eventually knocked on the bedroom door, asking if I was in there and if I was okay, to which I opened the door and burst into tears. They wrapped a blanket around me and asked me a few questions. Apparently, the man had already fled the scene and there was no sign of him. They also inspected the white bag, and rather than Chinese food, they found pretty much every ingredient you can imagine, where he clearly had been planning to tie me up and do God knows what. Well, as you can imagine, I was glad to be alive, but still incredibly shaken up, especially knowing that he was still out there somewhere. I did follow up with the police a few times, but unfortunately, they never had any leads or useful updates. They recommended I install cameras to help protect myself and be extra careful when ordering things online, but this was no way to live. I ended up cutting my lease short and moving to a new apartment on the other side of town. It was such a shame, because I loved that apartment, but I had no choice in the end. I was unable to sleep at night, and I pretty much lived in fear every single day. I still hold out hope that they will catch him eventually, and who knows, maybe they already have. But either way, I know I will never order food online again, as you never know who might be knocking on your door. It was the late 90s, and I was working as a pizza delivery driver to make some extra money. It was a typical night until I got an order to deliver to an old run-down motel on the outskirts of town. I thought this was odd, but every now and again we would get an order for a hotel of some sort, so I went ahead to the delivery location. The motel was in a creepy place, with flickering lights and peeling wallpaper. It was the kind of place where you half expected to see a ghost lurking around the corner. When I knocked on the door of the room, a man in his 40s answered. He had a strange look in his eyes, and I could tell that there was something off about him. He invited me inside to get my tip, but as soon as I stepped inside that room, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to leave, but the man grabbed me and dragged me into the bathroom. The room was small and dingy, with rusted pipes and broken tiles. I could see a bathtub in the corner, filled to the brim with a dark liquid that smelled putrid. "Do you know what this is?" the man asked, gesturing to the tub. I shook my head, trying to break free from his grip. "It's blood," he said, his eyes gleaming. "I need it. I have very important plans." I realized with horror that I was in the presence of someone truly insane, and I knew that I had to get out of there before it was too late. But that man was so strong. He held me in place as he chanted in a strange language. I noticed that his eyes were now closed, and he seemed truly engrossed in whatever it was he was saying, and so I took this opportunity to break free and run out of the bathroom. But as I fled, I heard the man yelling in anger, and I knew he wouldn't let me leave without a fight. As I ran through the motel hallway, I could hear the man's footsteps behind me. The hallway was dark and narrow, and I could barely see where I was going. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was sure that I was about to die if he caught me. But then I saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was the door to the outside world, and I knew that I had to get there before he caught up to me. I ran as fast as I could, my heart beating faster and faster, but just as I reached the door, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I screamed and pushed the door open, running into the night. As I sprinted away from the motel, I could see the man running with blood dripping from his hands. But luckily I could tell he was slowing down, and I just turned back around and kept sprinting. As I ran down the road, I looked back and saw that the man had in fact given up the chase. And so I just kept going, until I eventually reached a main road. I flagged down a passing car and I explained what had happened. The driver was a middle-aged man with a kind face, and he offered to take me to the nearest police station. When we arrived, I told the officers everything that had happened, and they immediately dispatched a team to investigate the motel. Within less than an hour, they had apprehended the man and managed to uncover a horrifying ritual chamber in his motel room. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for me, I quit my job as a pizza delivery driver and took some much-needed time off to recover from the traumatic experience. Years have now passed since that night, but I still think about it from time to time. It's a reminder that evil can lurk almost anywhere, and we should always trust our instincts. But either way, I'm so grateful for that kind stranger who helped me that night, because you never know. He may have been able to eventually catch up to me. Thank you for listening, and make sure to check out the on-screen playlist for more scary stories.